When we look at what's happening in the economy right now, a lot of the big shifts, they really seem to trace back to things like tariffs.
That's right. And these aren't just like abstract government policies floating around.
No, exactly. They're having a very real impact on the nuts and bolts of our lives, specifically manufacturing and construction.
Yeah, things we rely on every day. Think about the ripple effect, from the cars we drive to the homes we live in, even the roads and bridges connecting us.
It touches everything.
It really does. And we've been digging into this. Recent market research report came out April 28th, 2025. It really unpacks how these new tariffs are playing out.
Right. So the goal today is kind of cut through the noise, understand the concrete effects on these industries.
Exactly. And also see how businesses are, well, how they're adapting or trying to adapt to this whole new situation. It's pretty fluid.
Okay, so let's dive in. What specific tariffs are we actually talking about here, the ones causing these ripples?
Well, the report highlights a few key ones.
Hmm.
First, there's a 25% tariff on both steel and aluminum. Big ones.
Okay. Widely used materials.
Absolutely. Then you got a pretty significant 34% tariff specifically on construction equipment coming out of China.
34%. Wow.
Yeah. And finally, there are tariffs, sort of in the 10 to 15% range, hitting essential building materials, things like cement, glass, various wood products.
And these aren't niche items, are they? I mean, steel, aluminum, cement, cranes. That's fundamental stuff for making and building things.
Totally fundamental, which leads right to the core tension, doesn't it?
Yeah, this increased cost on basic components, it puts businesses in a tough spot.
They basically face a choice, right?
Yeah.
Either pass those costs on to us, the consumer, meaning higher prices for cars, homes, you name it,
Or,
or they absorb the hit themselves, which squeezes their profit margins, maybe impacts investment, jobs, things like that.
let's unpack that 25% on steel and aluminum first. The report emphasizes just how, well, ubiquitous these are.
Yeah, ubiquitous is the right word.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Car chassis, structural beams in buildings, appliances, it's everywhere.
Right.
And the thing is, major global suppliers, especially China, but other Asian countries too, they're hit by this, which potentially makes U.S. industries less competitive globally.
It really puts immediate pressure on a company needing steel, doesn't it? That extra 25%, it's not small change.
Not at all. And like you said, they either try to eat that cost, which might mean cutting back elsewhere.
Or they pass it on, and suddenly that new car or washing machine costs more. It feels a bit like a no-win situation sometimes.
Yeah, and consider the knock-on effects too. It's not always straightforward.
How so?
Well, say a small, seemingly minor component in a big machine suddenly jumps 25% because of the steel tariff.
Okay.
That small increase can actually have a disproportionately large impact on the final price of the whole machine, especially if cheap alternatives just aren't available.
That makes sense. Now, that 34% tariff on Chinese construction equipment, excavators, bulldozers, cranes, that sounds like a really massive jump.
It's a huge number. And the report mentions something quite telling from the Association of Equipment Manufacturers.
What's that?
Nearly 30%, almost a third, of that type of heavy equipment used here in the U.S. actually comes from China.
Wow. Okay, so a 34% tariff on nearly a third of the supply. How does that disrupt projects, especially ones already in progress?
Well, it forces companies to rethink their sourcing almost overnight. It's a shock to the system.
Right.
Imagine you're, say, a contractor bidding on a big infrastructure project. You budgeted based on getting a crane at a certain price. Suddenly, it's a third more expensive.
Throws the whole budget out the window.
Exactly. It can completely derail the financial model. And the report really highlights this is prompting a serious reevaluation of supply chains.
So companies are asking, where else can we get this stuff?
Pretty much. Can we find reliable alternatives?
Yeah.
Maybe in other countries? Or, does this suddenly make reshoring, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. look more viable, even with the setup costs?
Interesting shift. And then there are the 10 to 15% tariffs on those everyday building materials, cement, glass, wood. You mentioned construction has tight margins.
Extremely tight, often.
Yeah.
So even a 10 or 15% increase, which might sound smaller compared to 34%, can still have a really noticeable effect on the bottom line.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, the report uses drywall. It's a good one. A lot of our drywall is imported. Canada and China are big sources.
Okay.
So these tariffs have contributed to price surges for drywall.
Yeah.
And that's not just a minor inconvenience for a builder.
No, it means delays, right? And higher prices for the end buyer.
Precisely. Direct translation, construction projects get delayed, and ultimately the price tag on that new house or apartment goes up. It really shows those cascading effects clearly.
Okay, let's dig a bit deeper into specific sectors now. Manufacturing, especially heavy machinery and automotive, seems like a prime area affected by the steel and aluminum tariffs.
Definitely. What's really striking is how directly those raw material tariffs translate into higher operational costs for these guys.
Because steel and aluminum are core ingredients, not just minor parts.
Exactly. They are the
Ugh.
product in many ways. And the report points out the real challenges big U.S. automakers, Ford, GM, are facing just trying to source competitively priced steel and aluminum now.
Which naturally pushes up vehicle production costs.
It has to. So they're scrambling a bit, exploring options in places like Mexico, Eastern Europe, South Korea, trying to find more favorable pricing.
What about the smaller manufacturers? They might not have the clout of a Ford or GM. Are they in a tougher spot?
That's a really crucial point. Smaller manufacturers often lack that leverage to negotiate big deals or, quickly switch suppliers across the globe.
So reshoring or nearshoring might sound good, but it's harder for them.
It can be, yes. The upfront costs, the logistics, it's a heavy lift for a smaller business. And this is where, the report argues, market research becomes absolutely vital for them,
How so?
helping them pinpoint maybe less obvious, lower-cost suppliers or find ways to tweak their production to cope with these new tariff realities. It's about targeted intelligence.
Got it. Okay, switching to construction. The impact sounds incredibly broad there. Residential, commercial.
It really is. And the report cites this estimate from the National Association of Home Builders. It's quite startling.
What's the number?
They estimate these tariffs could add something like USD 14,000 to the price of a new single-family home.
14,000 just from tariffs. That's huge for a home buyer.
It really puts it in perspective, doesn't it? It creates significant financial pressure on residential construction. Higher costs can definitely cool down demand, impacting the whole housing market.
And it's not just homes, you said, commercial projects too.
Yeah, absolutely. Big commercial building projects are facing delays. Contractors are having to go back and rework budgets because materials cost more. And labor costs can get tangled up in this too, especially if supply chain issues cause slowdowns.
Makes sense.
You see it particularly in large urban developments. And the report notes this growing interest in looking at alternative building materials, different techniques, basically anything to manage costs.
And again, market research helps find those alternatives.
Exactly. Finding new material sources, maybe even identifying geographic markets that are less impacted by these specific cost pressures.
Okay, and the report also touches on industrial manufacturing, specifically electronics. Components like semiconductors, batteries. How are tariffs hitting them?
Oh, this is a big one. The electronics industry runs on these incredibly complex global supply chains.
Right, very interconnected.
So tariffs on essential components, semiconductors, batteries, things that go into our laptops, smartphones, everything, create major headwinds.
So what's the reaction?
There's a clear trend, according to the report, of manufacturers actively trying to reduce their reliance on Chinese imports for these critical parts.
Where are they looking instead?
Places like Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico come up as alternatives, but
There's always a but.
often these alternatives come with higher price tags, at least initially. So the dilemma for these companies is sharp. Absorb the extra cost and take a profit hit.
Or pass it on to consumers in a really competitive market, risking lower sales.
Precisely. It's a tough calculation.
The report puts some numbers on our overall reliance on imports for these sectors, something like $400 billion in 2023 for manufacturing and construction combined.
Yeah, around that mark. And the key part is that China contributed roughly $90 billion of that total.
$90 billion directly from China, including steel, aluminum, machinery components.
Exactly. It's not just finished goods. It's the fundamental building blocks. So when you slap tariffs on such a huge chunk of the supply chain,
The ripples spread far and wide, fast.
you got it. It just injects uncertainty, drives up costs across the board, and forces this scramble for alternatives we've been talking about.
And it gets even more complicated, right? Because it's not just the direct imports from China.
That's a really subtle but important point the report makes.
Tell me more.
There's another, say, $40 to $50 billion worth of construction-related components we import from intermediary partners. Think Mexico, South Korea, Canada.
Okay, so not directly from China.
But many of those partners themselves rely on materials or subcomponents sourced from China to make the things they sell to the U.S.
So even if it says made in Mexico, parts of it might trace back to China and be affected by these dynamics.
Exactly right. It shows how deeply embedded China is in the global manufacturing web. It means these tariffs can create inflationary pressures and complicate cost management even for goods seemingly coming from elsewhere. It's complex.
So, beyond just the direct costs, how else are these tariffs hitting firms? The report mentions things like tight margins and just-in-time inventory.
Yeah, those common business practices, while efficient in stable times, really amplify the pain when disruptions like tariffs hit.
How so? Less buffer.
Exactly. Thin profit margins mean there's very little room to absorb sudden cost spikes, and just-in-time inventory keeping minimal stock on hand makes companies incredibly vulnerable if the supply of a key part gets interrupted.
Leads to production stops, project delays.
Quickly. Very quickly. There's just no slack in the system.
And the report quantified those raw material cost hikes 15 to 30% for steel, cement, machinery parts. That's a huge hit to budgets.
It's substantial.
Yeah.
Especially for those big long-term infrastructure or housing projects where budgets were locked in maybe years ago before these tariffs were even on the radar.
Must lead to some tough conversations. Renegotiations.
Definitely difficult renegotiations. Sometimes projects get delayed indefinitely or even canceled. And the report also points to delays caused not just by cost, but by actual shortages of specific things.
Like what?
Things like specialized concrete additives or specific types of machinery, maybe because the Chinese suppliers are under strain or facing their own issues. These aren't just minor hiccups. They cause cascading delays through the whole system.
It's interesting, though, that companies are trying to adapt by shifting operations, looking at Vietnam, Mexico.
Yeah, there's definitely movement. But the report adds a dose of realism there, too.
It's not a magic bullet.
Not exactly. Diversifying supply chains is smart long-term, but it's not a quick fix. Setting up new plants, training workers, establishing new shipping routes, dealing with different regulations.
Takes time and money. Significant investment.
A lot of both. And, crucially, as we just discussed, even these alternative hubs might still rely on China for certain specialized components, so they aren't always completely insulated.
Right, the interconnectedness is hard to escape entirely.
Very hard.
So with all these challenges, complexities, the report really seems to position market research as, well, as essential, not just nice to have anymore.
That's spot on. It's framed as moving from a supplementary tool to something absolutely critical for strategic decision-making in this tariff-heavy environment.
Businesses just need better intel to navigate this.
Precisely. In a landscape that's changing so fast with new tariffs, shifting trade policies, you need reliable data, solid analysis to make good calls. Market research provides that window.
A window into what specifically? Alternative suppliers, pricing trends?
All of the above. It helps find those alternatives, understand global pricing, assess risks. Basically, it helps companies try to get ahead of the curve or at least react intelligently.
Let's break down how market research helps. The report mentions supplier mapping and risk assessment first. How does that work here?
Okay, so this is about proactively identifying and then really vetting potential alternative suppliers. Not just finding someone who makes the same thing, but digging deeper.
Looking beyond China towards places like Mexico, India, Eastern Europe.
Exactly. And the research goes into detail. Is the region politically stable? What's the supplier's actual production capacity? How efficient are their logistics? Can they deliver consistently on quality and cost over the long term?
So it's about reliability, not just price.
Absolutely. And crucially, it also involves ongoing monitoring, keeping an eye on geopolitics, anticipating new tariffs or sanctions that might pop up and affect these new supply lines. It's proactive vigilance.
That makes sense. You don't want to jump from one problem into another. What about tracking material costs and pricing?
Market research is key here for just keeping tabs on the fluctuating costs of essentials, steel, cement components, but also labor costs in different regions.
So you can forecast better.
Yes, forecast potential price increases. Develop smarter pricing models for your own products. It informs negotiations, too. Maybe you can lock in a long-term deal with a supplier in a non-tariff region. Or perhaps the data shows it's time to seriously evaluate switching to a different material altogether.
And then there's this idea of bill of materials BOM optimization. That sounds like getting really granular.
It is. It means looking at every single component that goes into your product.
Okay.
Market research helps pinpoint exactly how tariffs are impacting the cost of each individual screw, wire, or bracket. With that detailed view, you can then see opportunities.
Like what? Swapping parts.
Exactly. Maybe you can make a small design change to use less of a tariff-hit material. Maybe substitute one component for a similar non-tariff one from a different source. The report mentioned examples like switching from imported steel to local steel in construction.
Or finding a cheaper, non-tariffed part for a machine.
Precisely. It's about finding those savings at the component level, driven by detailed research.
What about predicting customer reactions, demand forecasting, and price sensitivity analysis?
Yeah, this is crucial. As costs go up and companies are forced to raise prices, they desperately need to know, how will our customers react?
Will they still buy?
Right. Market research provides tools to predict those shifts in demand. It helps analyze which customer segments are most sensitive to price hikes. For instance, the report suggests residential home buyers might react very differently to a price increase compared to, say, a government funding a huge infrastructure project.
So you can tailor your pricing strategy.
Exactly. Adjust pricing more strategically, knowing where you have flexibility and where you might face serious demand drops.
And lastly, regulatory tracking and scenario planning, keeping up with the rules.
More critical than ever. Trade rules, tariffs, agreements, they're constantly shifting. Market research helps provide that up-to-date intelligence.
And scenario planning. That sounds like what-if exercises.
That's basically it. Using tools to simulate different potential outcomes. What if country X imposes tariffs on our key material? What if this trade deal changes? It allows companies to think through contingencies.
And adjust procurement strategies proactively, rather than just reacting when something happens.
Exactly. It's about building resilience by planning for different futures.
So how are we actually seeing companies use these strategies? The report mentions electronics and construction firms adapting.
Yeah, we're seeing tangible responses. The report points to big players like Caterpillar, John Deere, making noticeable investments to diversify their manufacturing bases.
Moving some operations out of heavily tariffed regions.
Yes, expanding in places like India and Mexico, for example, to spread the risk and access different cost structures.
And smaller companies.
They're often looking closer to home, exploring partnerships with local suppliers, or seriously considering nearshoring to shorten those supply chains and gain more control.
Is technology playing a role in these adaptations?
Oh, definitely. There's a growing investment mentioned in digital tools. Think AI and machine learning powering sophisticated supply chain platforms.
What do those platforms do?
They help companies get much better at predicting demand, optimizing how and when they buy materials, and reducing those logistical delays and bottlenecks. It's all about using data for smarter, faster decisions across the entire supply chain.
Better supplier selection, better timing on procurement.
Exactly. Enhancing efficiency and making better calls in this really complex environment.
Okay, so wrapping this up, the core message seems clear. These new tariffs are creating really significant, complex challenges. It's not just one thing, it's hitting manufacturing and construction from multiple angles.
That's absolutely the key takeaway. Costs, supply chains, strategic planning, it's impacting everything.
And it's forcing a change in mindset.
Definitely. This isn't just about riding out a temporary price hike. It seems to represent a more fundamental shift in the global trade landscape. Businesses have to be more adaptable, much better informed, and more strategic than ever.
So market research and that kind of proactive adaptation aren't just optional anymore.
No, the report really frames them as essential survival tools now, necessary for navigating this evolving economic reality.
Well, that gives us a lot to think about. And perhaps here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to chew on.
Okay.
Considering just how interconnected these global supply chains really are, as we've discussed, what other unforeseen consequences might these tariffs trigger in the long term? Think beyond the immediate price increases we see on shelves or in project bids. What other ripple effects for businesses and for us as consumers might still be waiting down the line? Something to ponder. Thanks for diving deep with us today.